Why is my yarn gaslighting me? I thought we were friends. So recently I released a pattern called the Cashmere Outside Tee. That white one is made with cashmere, the brown one is made with a merino linen blend, and the burgundy one at the back is made with tweed. Each 3 sample is the exact same size. They're all knit to the measurement small. All 3 of them used a 3.5mm needle. All 3 of them hit almost the exact same gauge. And as you can see, all 3 of them are pretty much identical sizes. We're talking give or take a centimeter here or there. Mostly they're identical. I can lay each 3 of them on top of each other and they will measure exactly the same size. All 3 of them fall into a finger weight category. And I was under the impression that if a yarn is a fingering weight, if I use the same needle, if I meet the same gauge, and I make 3 of the same patterns, I should be using the exact same yardage in all 3 cases. But boy, was I wrong. So for this first one, I used Knitting for Olive compatible cashmere, and I held it double. Why? Because this yarn is essentially a lace weight on its own. And in my mind, holding a yarn double meant the distance between A and B would equal the distance between A and B, and not the total sum of the distance of the yarn. Well, if you thought the same, you're wrong and I'm wrong, and I'm about to explain to you why we're both quite wrong. So today we're going to do a deep dive on yardage. I'm going to break down the physics like a 5-year-old of what it means to actually hold something double. We're also going to get into why it is that my 3 tees, while all being identical, using what would appear to be an identical thickness yarn, all ended up eating 3 very different yardages, and the fascinating science behind why our yarn keeps gaslighting us. Okay, so we're going to start with yardage, and we're going to explain why holding something double does not in fact equal the distance between A and B, but it in fact equals the total sum of the yarn used. If you're much smarter than me and you already knew that, I'll catch you in the next part. But if you, like me, are a creative little baby angel who doesn't math and can't count and keeps scratching her head when things don't work out the way she thought they would, let's stick around. Essentially, if I wanted to make that sweater using this yarn held single, I would still end up using the exact same amount of yarn. Why? Because I would need to adjust my needle to be appropriate to fit the loop. So I would need to go much smaller. And in doing that, I would then end up knitting far more stitches in order to reach those exact measurements. So what I've done by holding it double is simply made my stitch bigger. The loop stitch, the knit stitch, is now bigger, and by doing that I'm now able to use a larger needle, which means I can knit faster, I can cover more space, but I'm still using the same yardage of yarn. With the same argument, if I held this single and I knitted it with a 2mm needle, 2.25mm needle, which I have actually done. If you watch my knitting with cashmere video, I did that with this white tee, but in a beige version, and I accidentally felted it. It's a whole long story, go check it out. I ended up using the exact same amount of yarn that I did for the one that I've held double by holding it single using a smaller needle and making it the same measurement. So does that then mean that a thicker stitch is now changing the loop? Now here's where it gets slightly more interesting. So like I just mentioned earlier, when you hold yarn double, you're not just using 2 strands. You're also creating a thicker combined strand, and thicker strands curve differently. In addition to that, different yarns have different densities, and the way that they're going to interlock together is going to behave differently depending on the density of the yarn. So for example, if I use a super dense yarn like cashmere, when those stitches lock together, there's going to be little to no compression where these two threads are locking and meeting. Whereas if I use a super squishy yarn like the tweed, where they meet and lock, they're actually going to compress and sink into each other. And this doesn't make a huge difference when we're measuring out a gauge. For example, I hit exact same gauge with all 3 tees. But it does make a difference when you zoom into the actual stitch itself. The little loop, if you take that stitch and you pull it out and you measure it, the distance is going to differ a little bit, like a tiny little bit, between something so dense like cashmere and something so light and fluffy like this super fine merino tweed. And that tiny little difference makes a big difference when we're talking hundreds of meters. So in conclusion, that's why holding a yarn double doesn't actually magically save yarn or yardage like I genuinely thought it did. In truth, all it does is increase consumption and give you a denser, thicker garment. And that's before we even get into fibre behaviour like I briefly touched on just now. So now here's the next confusing part, which we briefly touched on earlier. How do these 3 samples that all measure exactly the same eat up completely different amounts of yardage? And that is all explainable by density and fibre behaviour, and I'm going to go a little deeper into that now. So even when a yarn is a similar thickness and you can meet the exact same gauge, they're going to behave differently. Because the actual fibre itself, is it cashmere? Is it linen? Is it a merino? And the way that it's spun changes everything completely. This cashmere here is very, very dense. It also means that it's going to be very drapey and it's going to be very heavy. Cashmere is an animal fiber. It's extremely fine and very, very soft, and it can be deceivingly dense. This one here is a lace weight 2-ply halve double. And what that means in normal language is it's very smooth, it's very compact, and it drapes like an expensive curtain. And this one is the heaviest. It weighs at around 200 grams. Cashmere also has a luxurious flop factor. It wants to fall and drape. So, for example, the structure of that tee requires you to use shoulder seams is actually really necessary when using a yarn like cashmere, because you're going to want to help those seams stay together and not just fall and disperse everywhere as they would in a top-down construction. In sample B, I used a merino linen blend, a 70% merino and a 30% linen. This one is very smooth, crisp, stable. There's very little bounce. Merino linen is a wool and a plant blend. Merino has the bounce, linen has a lot of structure. So when we added the linen, we've added a crispness, we've added strength, and we've added a kind of stay where you are energy. So this tee didn't really grow much, it didn't bloom, it didn't do anything dramatic. It simply just flattened and settled down, and of the 3 of them, it has the tightest stitch definition. We would say that it behaves, or in knitting terms, it has low elasticity and it doesn't collapse inwards. So this is sample 3, and in this one I used a super fine tweed, a super fine merino tweed. This yarn is woolen spun. It is airy and it's very bloomy and it's very light. So woolen spun basically is yarn that traps air. That's going to make it lighter, it's going to make it loftier, it's going to make the stitches bloom a lot more, and it's going to be warmer without being heavy. This one is only around 100 grams and it used about just over 700 meters of yarn. It literally was like knitting a cloud. This one also behaved the most dramatically after blocking it. So just for clarity, I steam blocked all 3 of these tees. Because why? Because I accidentally felted the first cashmere tee by putting it in the washing machine and blocking it that way. Do not do that. Do not put cashmere in the washing machine. And after getting the shock of my life, I decided to only steam block that one, and because I'd steam blocked the cashmere tee, I then proceeded to steam block all 3 of them because I wanted to do a measured, controlled experiment on gauge and yardage and weight. And after steaming the tweed, it actually grew. It grew about 2 centimeters at the bottom, and the sleeves got a bit longer, and all of the stitches puffed out and bloomed out. So how does yardage actually work? This is basically the core concept. Gauge is going to measure space, while yardage measures the path length. And same spacing does not guarantee the same path length. So a knit stitch is a loop. You can think of a horseshoe shape, and you can think of 2 of them and they intertwine like this. They don't just sit flat, they interlock and they press each other at certain points. Now imagine 2 different yarns making the exact same stitch. One yarn is very squishy, and at that compression interlocking point, it actually squishes itself, and the other one is going to stay round and resist that compression completely. So if the yarn compresses at that crossing point, the loops actually sit together more tightly, which means the yarn can take a slightly shorter path through that stitch. But if the yarn stays round and firm, the loop is going to stay more open and rounded, making that yarn path a little bit shorter. And if you're thinking, okay, but that's microscopic, a tiny difference per stitch times thousands of stitches is going to equal meters. So yardage is going to change because of 3 main variables. How long the yarn is for its weight. Some yarns have more meters per gram and some actually have fewer. How the yarn behaves inside of its stitch. Squishy versus firm. Compressing at the crossing point versus staying round. And finally, what the fabric does after it's been knit up. Does it bloom? Does it grow? Does it relax? Does it pull towards itself? If you look at my 3 tees, the cashmere used 900 meters, it weighs 200 grams, it drapes a lot, it feels very dense, whereas the merino linen used around 610 meters, it weighs 160 grams, it's very crisp and very stable. And then the merino tweed used around 705 meters. It only weighs 102 grams. It's very bloomy, it's very airy, and it grew lengthwise. Same pattern, same gauge, same size. But 3 very different internal yarn behaviors, 3 very different weights, and 3 very different meters per gram, because all 3 of them have a different loop compression. And that is why yardage is not a single universal metric. So basically the takeaway here is that matching gauge is the first step, but it's not the whole story. And if you're a designer in here, a good takeaway for you would be, if you want to give good yardage guidance, you either need to test multiple yarn types, kind of like I did, or give a generous range, or as with most of us do, use a very specific yarn for a very specific pattern. Another thing for designers that you want to take away is the way that that yarn behaves requires different structure. So I would say some yarns are fine to do a top-down raglan style, and others really do need seams and infrastructure. Because the long story short, yarn isn't just fingering weight or DK weight. Yarn is physics disguised as fluff. So if this melted your brain, same, honestly same. I had several moments where I was scratching the inside of my head trying to understand the physics and the logic behind all of this. But the secret is, space is not the same as path length. So, another soft sweater hard facts by Arlie Knits. If you made it this far, This pattern is actually on sale over on my website, ollyknits.com, and the pattern is called the Cashmere Outside Tee. I'm going to be running it at 20% off for the next 2 weeks before I move on to my next pattern, which I'm extremely excited about. It's the typewriter cardigan using Ching Melted Baby Suri, and it's going to be so beautiful, but I'll go into this in more detail later. And also, if you're still here, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe, and if you did enjoy the video, please give it a little like. These things really help me out. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one when we go to Yarniversity with Ollie Knits.